Thanks everyone for joining us today in person and on Zoom. I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, who is Ivetta Sergeeva, a PhD candidate at the European University Institute in Florence. She specializes in political behavior, civil society, and Russian immigration. She's a co-founder and co-principal investigator of Outrush and Violence Monitor, a series of surveys on intimate partner violence in Russia. She also has 8 years of experience supervising projects in civil society and human rights organizations in Russia. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. And today's presentation about the fact of discrimination on integration of politically induced migrants. In our case, it's about Russian migrants who left the country after invasion of Ukraine. And my name is Ivetta Sergeeva. I'm a PhD student at the European University Institute. Here I'm a visiting scholar at Harmony Institute. And let me start my presentation by introducing you the projects that we draw our data from and our inspiration. The project is called Outrush. It's a project about Russians who left the country after invasion of Ukraine. As probably many of you know, according to different estimates, there may be up to 1 million Russians who left after the invasion. And Outrush project, it's a panel survey of these migrants. Panel survey means that we survey the same respondents over regular amounts of time. This means that we can trace changes in their life situations, and we attribute it not to random fluctuations of the sample, but rather actual changes in their lives. And we started this project in the earliest stage of invasion. So the first wave we conducted it's in March 2022, and we made a second wave in September 2022, and finally the third wave we made in summer 2023. This project was founded by me and Emil Kamalov, who is here in the room, and other scholars joined us. We made these 3 waves in collaboration with Karolina Nagumanova, Nika Kostenko, Margarita Zavadska. We also collaborated with migrant-based NGOs who helped us to distribute a link among migrants and to build trust with them. And this project is institution-based. It means that we all our ways are approved by ethical committee. We also have clearance from data manager. We try to be as transparent as possible about the way how we collect the data, how we use it, and how we store it. So currently around 3,000 respondents participate in each wave of our panel. And it means that overall, more than 10,000 respondents participated in the panel. And now these people reside in more than 100 countries, so it's quite diverse sample. We have a lot of international media attention and attention from the community of migrants itself. We believe it's also because we try to share our funding in non-academic materials as well. So we really try to give back information that we collect and analyze. And we also had a really fruitful collaboration with Project Commons that is led by Regina Smith and Diana University in Bloomington. And we collected together more than 500 interviews in 5 countries. And many of informants were recruited from our surveys. So for a lot of people, we have both statistical data and qualitative data with in-depth understanding of their fears, expectations. So we work with statistical data and complement it with qualitative data that we get thanks to this collaboration. So what is the motivation for this particular presentation? This flow is believed to be very influential for different aspects of host country's lives. We already have some understanding how exactly this flow can change host country lives and lives of these citizens. And from our survey, we know that many of people are quite successful in integration. Many of them learn the local language. We know that a lot of people who previously were employed by Russian companies are now working for other local companies or international companies. That means that they're also quite successful in economic integration. We also trace the level of trust to hosting societies, and we know that at least for trust to local citizens is quite high. It doesn't seem to be decreasing. So they're also quite successful in social integration. Doesn't take a lot of backlash from local citizens, according to our data. But we know at the same time that the reception is very different in different countries. According to our data, 23% of respondents reported being discriminated. And these levels of discrimination is quite high compared to what we know about discrimination in Europe towards migrants who live in Europe. It's around 15%. But we know also that this discrimination is quite different in different countries. In some countries, it's as low as 5%, while in other countries, it can be as high as 30%. So 30% of migrants can report discrimination in some countries. In our survey, we study discrimination, both discrimination from local citizens and from local institutes. And let me show you the map that we've been working on. And there is a map of levels of discrimination in different countries. And I just excluded the countries with less than 30 observations. So in these countries, we have at least we have more than 30 observations, and in many countries we have more than 600 observations. And let's take a look on, for example, Georgia. Here you can see discrimination from locals that people reported in the last 3 months in summer of 2023. And you can see that at least 30% of respondents reported being discriminated by locals in Georgia in this period of time. And let's take a look now in Armenia, that is quite close geographically. But only 9% of respondents reported being discriminated by locals in the same period of time. We have this range of different levels of discriminations for many countries, and let's take a look for discrimination from institutions. Once again, we have Georgia. There only 17% of people reported being discriminated by local institutions. It means that people reported being discriminated, for example, by banks or by migration services. In Armenia, 13% of people reported being discriminated by local institutions. And here we also have, for example, Estonia. There 38% of respondents reported being discriminated by local institutions. So as you can see, the range of discrimination is quite different, not just for different countries, but within the countries, but for different types of discrimination. And a bit of self-promotion, these kind of maps we'll be having on our site, Outrush, in the future. So people who work with, who study Russian situation of Russian migrants can use it for their research. So we know that these people are being discriminated on different levels, but we don't really know how exactly discrimination affect the assimilation, affect the integration efforts. What we know from theory about effect of discrimination on integration. First of all, we have a theory of identity development by Laitin. It was a study of Russian ethnic minorities who lived in near abroad after the collapse of Soviet Union. And Laitin basically says in this model that the willingness to integrate depends on perceived economic and social benefits. So we can conclude that possibly if people are discriminated against, it may signal them that the community is not quite welcoming, and it's maybe not the very rational choice to integrate and to learn the local language. At the same time, we have some awesome empirical research by Fuka, who studied response on discrimination by German ethnic minorities during First World War. And she says that discrimination may facilitate assimilation. It's a kind of coping strategy that people are discriminated against, and they try not to be discriminated against anymore. So what they do is accelerate their assimilation efforts. And she proxied it by proving that German ethnic minorities who were discriminated against were trying to name children with more internationally sounded names and also apply for naturalization more. And we also have another empirical studies that work with the same population, German in the US during First World War. The researcher Ferrara basically says that discrimination push ethnic minorities from the country completely, and shows that in US states that Germans were discriminated against, they were trying to flee the country, that in the end exacerbated economic results of these US states. So there is a graph where they can see possible response of migrants on discrimination. These responses that are depicted here are mostly drawn from literature on ethnic minorities, but for the sake of this paper, I think that we can use this series and to speculate that there's at least 3 possible responses of migrants for discrimination. It's either isolation, and the person doesn't learn the language because doesn't feel that the host community is welcoming enough and it's worth the effort. It's assimilation and trying to reduce discrimination by being as much as integrated as possible. So learning the language can be a good coping strategy for it. And finally, the person can leave the country whatsoever. And we have these 3 possible responses, but we don't really know what exactly facilitates each of these. So by doing this study, we're trying to understand how discrimination will affect integration efforts by Russian migrants. For this study, I used data from 2 panel waves of outrage. The panel wave that was conducted in August-September 2022, and a wave that was conducted in May-July 2023. And 1,300 participants participated in both waves. That constitutes a panel sample of this study. I also used analysis of interviews that we conducted collaboratively with Project Commons in interviews in Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and Serbia. To see the effect of discrimination on integration of Russian migrants, I used a fixed effect model. There I control for individual-based characteristics and country-based characteristics. I also was trying to understand how different social demographic characteristics of migrants themselves may contribute to their response to discrimination. So I also used a linear regression model with interactions, and I also analyzed interviews. So the main explanatory variable is discrimination from local citizens and local institutes, something that should affect integration of Russian migrants. And I was interested in 3 main outcome variables. The first one is willingness to learn the local language. The second is staying in the country. And finally, plans to stay in the country in the future. Here you can see the results of first model, effect of discrimination on willingness to learn the local language. Learning local language means that at least 86% of people were learning local language at the time of the survey, on average. And this is a fixed effect model. The first model is a fixed effect individual model. That means that it controls for all individual level characteristics for people who participated in the second and the third wave of outrage. And the second model here also controls additionally for country-based characteristics. So you can see that 86% of people were trying to learn the local language, but discrimination from locals is related to 10% decrease of willingness to learn the local language. You can see the discrimination from institutions doesn't have the same significant effect on willingness to learn the local language. So of those 68% of people who learn the local language, at least 10% don't learn the local language, and according to model, it's correlated with discrimination from local citizens. There's some evidence for qualitative data. I didn't find maybe yet the evidence that people would try not to learn the local language because of discrimination, but I did find the evidence that people consider it to be a good strategy to learn language if they find that the society is quite accepting. So here you can see the excerpt from interview that the person says that she really wants to learn the Kazakh language, that they are currently looking for a teacher, and she thinks that the desires appeared as soon as they entered the country. And it's a way, learning language, to show respect to the people living in the country because they greatly respect being accepted here. In fact, they do accept us there, and they never heard any Russians go home. So she explains the willingness to learn the language by feeling accepted by local community. There is another citation from another informant. They say that they basically want to start a business in Kazakhstan, and they think that learning the language is a really good way to interact with different segments of the population in the country. And I interpreted it as being, as considered this country to be a long-stay country and feeling accepted by local society. So here you can see the results of another model. This is a model of decision to leave the country whatsoever. So how we did it? We checked if the person reported to be discriminated by locals, either by locals on the street or in some social meetings, or by institution in September 2022. And then we checked if this person left the country that they stayed in the summer, so later in 6 months. So here you can see that in the period between September 2022 and summer 2023, at least 18% of Russian migrants left the host country. So they changed the country that they were residing in. And you can see that the discrimination in the second model that controls for host country characteristic, you can see that discrimination from locals contributes at least 8% to this decision. That makes that discrimination from locals, people who be discriminated from local citizens were 8% more likely to leave the country that they stayed in the period of 6 months. We can also see that discrimination from institution also contributes significantly to the decision to leave the country, the host country. And I find this result very interesting because discrimination from institutions can prohibit the person from staying in the country whatsoever. Because if you're not getting your residence permit, you have to leave the country. But for discrimination from locals, it doesn't, if you report discrimination from locals, it doesn't mean that you have to leave the country. But you can see that discrimination from locals has the same effect as discrimination from institutions. So discrimination from locals contributes significantly to the decision to leave the country, even though it's not prohibited from staying there. So once again, I found some qualitative evidence of decision to leave a host country that is linked to the feeling of being discriminated. Here, the person who was residing in Georgia at the moment of interview was saying that she wasn't feeling exactly welcomed there. And she was constantly feeling discomfort, and she understands that it's related to relationship of Georgia with Russia. She sympathized with local citizens, but at the same time, she thinks she wouldn't stay there long. And there is another informant who says that they have concerns that in Tbilisi, the atmosphere will be less friendly, and they would like to live in a country that there is less of that kind of discrimination. So in both these interviews, our informants say that they are willing to leave the hot country because of unwelcoming atmosphere there. So finally, to understand what prompts different responses to discrimination, we analyzed how social characteristics of migrants related to plans to stay in the host country. And it's quite reasonable to assume that a decision to exit country is something that that not all people can afford. Our hypothesis was that only those who have more resources and more affluent migrants can exit the country whatsoever. And here you can see the results of the model that predicts a willingness to stay in the country. This is something that we asked in the last wave of outrash. And different social characteristics that can contribute to decision. So here you can see in the first model that in all three models, you can see that discrimination from locals contributes significantly to decision to stay in the hosting country. For example, in the first model, if the person was discriminated by locals, reported being discriminated by locals, it decreases the willingness to stay in the country by 0.2 its points, because it's from 1 to 5. We ask them whether they want to stay in the country from on the scale from 1 to 5. But at the same time, even if the same person has international employment, it's additionally contributed to desire to leave the country and making it making willingness to stay in the host country by 0.5 points less. So if the person was experiencing discrimination and has international employment, it significantly contributed to desire to leave the country. We see the same results for income. So once again, in the second model, you can see the discrimination from local citizens contributes significantly to desire to leave the country. But at the same time, if a person has quite high income, it's contributes to decision to leave the country significantly more. We don't see the same result for education. It's interesting because, and the way how I interpret this is not all sorts of education allows you to leave the country and be that privileged. And possibly only easily transferred skills, such as skills that possessed by tech specialists, allows you to leave the country whatsoever and be more sensitive to discrimination. Here you can see the graph that depicts interaction effects of discrimination and having an international job on plans to stay in the country. And you can see the first green bar that represents people who were discriminated and who were not discriminated and had international job. Their willingness to stay in the country is much higher compared to those people who were discriminated and have international job. Here is a piece of qualitative evidence for these effects. So this is an interview from specialists who had an international remote job, who are basically saying that they had experience communicating with individuals who encountered such unpleasant interactions, they mean discrimination with border guards. And they are not afraid of these scenarios because they are not tied to this community. They can always just leave. And they recognize that this is a privilege just to leave the community that is not welcoming and most likely linked to the occupation. So to conclude the presentation, we learned that discrimination from local citizens, but not from local institute, decreases willingness to learn local language. The way how we interpret these results is related to the fact that Russian migrants currently encounter discrimination from local institutes, mostly globally, because international sanctions affect Russian nationals all around the world. So maybe that's why discrimination from local institutes doesn't contribute as much as in willingness to integrate, because people just understand that this is the way how a lot of institutes currently work towards Russian nationals. At the same time, being discriminated by local citizens has significant effects and decreases willingness to learn the language. Discrimination from local institute has similar effect for living in a hosting country as discrimination from institutions, which I say is quite interesting, I think, because discrimination from local institutes can oblige you to leave the country, but discrimination from local citizens usually doesn't. But it's at the same time, it has the same effect on decision to leave the country. So people who reported being discriminated against by locals had the same chance to leave the country in 6 months as people who reported discriminated being discriminated by local institutes. And finally, our interaction model shows that leaving the host country due to discrimination is not option for everyone. And it's mostly option for affluent, resourceful migrants who usually considered a brain gain for host communities. And this kind of reconciles the different results that we see in empirical studies, why some people decided to leave while others decide to stay. Here we see that, yes, some people decide to leave, but only if they can afford it. Other people just decide to stay, and most likely if they are discriminated against and feel that the society is not welcoming enough, they decide that it's not a rational choice for them to learn the language. So yeah, the main conclusion is that discrimination can be a push effect for brain gain migrants, and this is something that is evidenced at least for these populations that we work with. Thank you.
Okay, so we can open it up to questions. It looks like we already have a question on Zoom, so we can go with that first. Andrea Liu, if you could introduce yourself, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thank you so much for this rich presentation. I just had a couple of questions. I guess it's my first question is around this term discrimination. Do you can you give us some ideas of when you give a questionnaire and they say, have you been discriminated against? What constitutes in their mind discrimination? Like I'm thinking about this thing about institutions and were they discriminated against by institutions? I mean, I'm from the art world, and institutions are very opaque. And if they discriminate against you, you would never know. They would never there was no way you would be able to find out. I mean, they would come up with some excuse. You know, there's not a lot of transparency with institutions in my world. So I'm curious, like, how do they even know that they were discriminated against? And is it something with animosity? Like you're sitting on a bus and somebody says, you know, Russians get out, you know, of my country, or is it something more subtle, like condescension, you know, like it's yeah. So that's my first question about discrimination. My second question, I don't know if this is relevant to your study, but let me try to ask you anyways. I have a question about the word expatriate versus migrant. And because most of the year I live in Berlin, and there's a huge Russian, since the war, there's been a huge influx of Russian art. You know, I come from I write about visual arts, so I mostly know Russian artists. And I'm curious, I mean, I know the common connotation is that expatriate is sort of more like a privileged person who can go wherever they want, who feels like, experiencing a new culture. And migrant, at least as I know it, you think of people from a lower economic tier who like economic, like, so I'm curious if we retitled your whole study, expatriates, Russian expatriates, I guess that would not work, right? Because you want to use the word. I'm just curious if you can talk about migrant versus expatriate. And then my third question, I'm sorry, this is the last one. I, in the US, there's this term passing, right? Like where, say, African Americans, if they're light skinned, people will say this person passes for white. And I'm curious, when you're talking about the people in Kazakhstan and Georgia, facing hostility and blah, 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 is there any dynamic of this thing of passing? And I don't encourage it. I don't think it's a good thing to try to hide who you are, but I'm curious. I mean, a Russian person, unless they're applying for a job, they don't have to say that they're Russian. If they're going to face discrimination, they could pass. I mean, I guess if you're in Georgia or Kazakhstan, it's obvious you're not Georgian and you're not Kazakhstan because you don't speak the language. But I'm curious if there's this type of thing where they pass a dynamic where they know they're going to be discriminated against, so they try to, dissimulate, which is, I guess, a fancy word for lying about that they're Russian. I don't encourage that. I'm just curious if there's that phenomenon. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you so much for the questions. So for the first question, what constitutes discrimination? Which is something that I mentioned, but just in passing, how we measure discrimination. We had a battery of questions for each type of discrimination. Then we asked basically, have you encountered discrimination? Maybe not the best way to ask it, but we asked this exact word. Have you encountered discrimination because of your nationality in the last 3 months? And we also measured discrimination from the very beginning of migration for each respondents. And for the first type, social discrimination from local citizens, we asked them if they encountered discrimination in different social situations, for example, in the store, on the party, on the street. And if a person indicated that they encountered discrimination in at least one of the social discriminations, we measured this in at least one case of being discriminated. So for the discrimination from institutes, we did the same, but we listed some popular local institute, popular among migrants, like banks, migration services, police. And we did the same. If the person indicated that they encountered discrimination in at least one of these organizations, we counted as being discriminated against. I want to reiterate that this discrimination is perceived discrimination. So how is the person felt that they were discriminated against? And this self-reported perceived discrimination is a common way to measure discrimination. And it's used quite a lot in different studies. And perceived discrimination maybe as important for understanding the response of discrimination as something that was, documented as, for example, hate speech. So if the person thinks that they were discriminated against, their response would be accordingly to thinking that. I hope I answered the first question for what constitutes discrimination. For the second question, expatriate versus migrant. So in our team, we had a lot of discussion how we should, name these people that we work with. We were trying to highlight that these people are migrants. They are not relocants. That is also linked to, economic decision to migrate just as expatriate. We were thinking about calling them people in exile, but it's also quite problematic because although for many of these people, their decision to leave was connected with the political situation in Russia, not all of them are, professional activists. They may have different political attitudes toward Russia, towards Russian government, probably critical one, but at the same time, using the word in exile, we decided that it's maybe a bit too politically loaded. Expatriate, yes, I agree that is probably also a bit loaded in terms of that it highlights the economic aspect of being migrated, of migration. At the same time, we know for many of these people, this decision to migrate was not economically beneficial for them. They, in fact, are losing money, not gaining money from this migration. For the passing question, I think it's very interesting thing to think about. I'm not sure that I encountered, any facts of this behavior, at least not from interviews that I already read. What they try to do, I think they often describe uncomfortable situation of trying to understand how they should communicate with local citizens and other in Russian or in English. If we talk about countries, there are a lot of people speak Russian. And maybe they were not trying to pass for locals, but at least they're trying to communicate that they definitely want to use Russian as not as a primary language, but they first are trying to speak English, for example, in Georgia. Not sure that it's linked to passing per se, but it's an interesting kind of observation for this population.
Thank you.
More questions?
Yeah, my question is related to learning the local language. And I have actually, I'd subdivide that into 2 or 3 questions maybe. The first one is, I didn't really understand why that's an important indicator. It seems like it would be very, very different depending on the country. In some countries, and as you said yourself, in some countries it can be economically beneficial. In some countries it wouldn't be economically beneficial. In some places, if you just use English or Russian, that'll be fine. In some places that wouldn't be fine. Secondly, unlike perceived discrimination, learning a language or not learning a language could be objectively tested, right? So it could be the case that a bunch of people said, well, I want to learn Georgian, or I'm going to learn Georgian, or Kazakh, or whatever other language we're talking about here. And then we find that they've reached a level of, say, A2 after 3 years and kind of stopped at that, or they actually decided to go to B2 or C1. Doesn't this create a problem of perceived desire to learn the language versus not perceived? And thirdly, I didn't really understand the use of learning a language within the overall framework. Is this a means to test if people are willing to integrate or not? Or does the desire to learn the language, more important in their attempt to integrate than actually learning the language? Are there other ways to test integration? Sort of this wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for this question. So for the learning language, yes, we did use this as a proxy for integration. We based this decision on the model of Laitin, that is, who basically says that decision to learn language is related to willingness to integrate, and I completely agree that for different countries it may be more or less beneficial to learn the local language. For example, for people residing in Germany, it may be more beneficial compared to people who reside in Georgia. But at the same time, if the person already had decision to stay in the country for a long time, it would be beneficial to learn the language even if it's not Germany, even if it's Georgia, because probably you will be interacting with locals. Probably your kid will be, attending a local kindergarten, and there are a lot of reasons why would you learn local language if you want to stay in the country. So that's why we decided to use a learning local language as an indicator of willingness to integrate. And this is something that is confirmed by interviews. For example, the interview of the person who decided to stay in Kazakhstan for a long time because they want to open the business there. And they say that, yeah, of course, we want to learn the local language. And Kazakhstan, a lot of people in Kazakhstan speak Russian, and Russian is official language in Kazakhstan, one of the official languages. But at the same time, they still want to learn the local language because it would help them to integrate, it would help them to make their business successful. And in the models that we use, we control for all country-based characteristics. So we kind of make it permanent for Germany or Kazakhstan. We control for them, and we try to understand what is the average effect of discrimination on learning the local language, no matter if it's Germany or Kazakhstan, although for different countries it can be different benefits, of course.
How does the control work? Is it based on local GDP, or how do you do that?
It controls for all the characteristics of the countries.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
So for the willingness to learn language couldn't be objectively testing. Yes, it's definitely the problem, but it's a problem for many questions in the survey, right? Like there is certainly can be some level of preference falsification that people say that yes, we'd be happy to learn the local language at the same time not learning it, or learning with minimal effort. We were trying to experiment with the way how we ask this question. We also, in the third way, they ask if they put a lot of effort in learning the language or if they put a minimal effort in learning the language. This is something that we can also, account for maybe in the future research. So yeah, hope I answered this. Yeah.
I have a question about the institutional discrimination part. So in your survey, is there this notion of that these migrants are aware of? So for me, there's two perception of institutional discrimination. The first type is just that in general, this country has a very strict policy for migrants. For example, when I was an exchange student in Berlin, oh my God, I was trying to get a bank account. It doesn't, but I know that they don't discriminate me because I am, let's say, from Russia or from China, but it's because I'm a foreigner.
Mm-hmm.
So is there this notion among these migrants, along the distinction, especially in local institutions? Because on the other hand, these local institutions are all staffed by locals. So is this perception of discrimination also transferable between the local institutions and the local people? Let's say that if I go to a bank in Berlin, and then the staff is really rude to me because they know that I'm a migrant, then I might also transfer this perception of discrimination to the locals. So basically I have two questions. First, the distinction between the general and the specific discrimination. And second is how transferable are those two types of discriminations?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I don't think that by the means of this survey, we can definitely say that these people are aware that whether they were discriminated against as Russian migrants or just migrants in general. I assume that they have some notion because what we ask them, whether they think they were discriminated against as Russian. So, but we don't know for sure, and I think that this is related to your second question, if they understand that, okay, in this migration office, I was discriminated because I'm Russian, or in this I was discriminated because I'm migrant. So we ask them to indicate whether they feel they were discriminated against as Russian because of the Russian passport, basically because of this red passport, and whether it happened because of them being Russian or not, we don't know, unfortunately. But from what we know from interviews, from qualitative data, I think that especially for the social discrimination part, many Russian migrants are quite well aware that this is something that relates to their nationality, especially when you see something like Russian go home or all Russians are terrorists. This is something that you kind of know that is related to your nationality. But I think that, yeah, I agree that with local institutes, it's trickier because, yeah, you don't know whether it's regulation for all people who just migrated or just for Russians, and whether it's because of international sanctions or because this particular bureaucrat just doesn't like it. Yeah.
More questions? Okay, if nobody has a question, then I will ask a question. Okay, a few few different questions here. So my first question, I thought the observation about people who have international employment was interesting, and I wonder what you think is going on there. So if you're employed by an international company, and if you have an idea within that category, the subsets of like people who are independently employed, like have companies who might differ slightly, I feel a little bit more independent than people who are like employed by foreign companies. Why do you think it is that it's that they're more discouraged by discrimination, or perhaps even reporting being discriminated against more often? And do you have an idea of the possibilities that people have in mind when they say, okay, I've experienced discrimination and I don't want to stay here, I want to go somewhere else? Like, do people just feel more free? They have more ideas of places they can go? Sorry, that's a very sort of vague question. And then, like extrapolating from this finding, can we say here that wealthier people, or people who are internationally employed, who are presumably also wealthier, are less political, or less politically engaged, or less willing to sort of integrate into the political context and take on that role? And then my other question was about, sorry, just reading my notes here. Okay, I'll start with that question and then I'll come back with another one.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So for the international company, so those people who work for international company, this I think is an indicator that you can actually easily change the country, and it's something that you can do. You're not linked to this country professionally, you're not linked to this country geographically, you just have more life chances to move around. And I think that's why they are less tolerant toward discrimination. But I think that also something that you mentioned is very important. We didn't see that people who are, for example, employed by international companies or who are wealthier reported discrimination more often. So there is no difference, at least in basic social demographic characteristics, between those who reported discrimination and those who didn't. So it doesn't look like some people are more sensitive to being discriminated, like at least to feeling like they're discriminated against. But some people definitely are more sensitive to take some action because of it. And those people who, at least how we interpret it, have actual resources to take some action, they just move around and try to find maybe more comfortable place to live. But for those who don't have this option, it's possible. We don't know. This is something that was monitoring, but it looks like, at least from these results, that for them, the coping strategy is not trying to learn local language, but rather to withdraw themselves from local communities. And it's maybe it maybe will lead to some isolation. We will see, but yeah, this is something that I think that was also important to say. For your question about less and more politically engaged, as I said, we didn't see any difference of more or less politically engaged. They didn't report more or less discrimination based on that, but I don't remember if it was some correlation between wealthier and more politically engaged, but definitely it doesn't link to discrimination, to be more sensitive to discrimination.
Any more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm obsessed with language. I'm gonna have a few more questions, that's okay. So, if there's an additional factor or a number of additional factors that lead to, people learning the language in a certain country being a greater sign of integration or a lesser sign of integration, how would you define these factors? Because I'm, off the top of my head, I didn't do all the research that you guys did, so obviously I'm not going to be particularly good at this, but I'm thinking of a country like the United Arab Emirates, right? Rich country, people don't need to learn the local language. probably don't really, most people don't really, who came there from somewhere else don't learn Arabic in order to integrate into society, especially Russian immigrants. Country like Indonesia, people come to Bali, they probably don't learn the local language, despite Bali being much poorer than United Arab Emirates. And then you take a country like Georgia, and what I struggle with is that I don't really understand. Is the model in Georgia for integration similar to the UAE or Bali, as the local laws suggest? It's very easy to come there. It's relatively easy to open a bank account compared to a lot of other countries, et cetera, et cetera. Or is the integration model more similar to a country like Poland, let's say, where it's expected that you're going to learn the local language, you will do yada, 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 yada. And what would be that other factor or other sets of factors that would explain whether that's a good proxy or not for integration?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to think about. I think that it's a good sign of at least something that I'm thinking now, that it's a good sign of good indicator of integration if you learn language, although you don't have to. Like, for example, you can live in Kazakhstan and use Russian. You can live in Georgia and use Russian or English. But if you learn the language in these countries, then you don't have to. You don't forced, by law. You don't forced to learn it, because you can easily communicate not using it. It's probably a good sign that you're, consider integration in this community, that you consider probably to stay here longer. It can not be a sign of that you just pay respect to these people, but probably you want. Especially if you're super busy with other stuff that is going on in your life, you won't be contributing a lot of efforts in learning language. But if you're very serious about it in the country, then you don't have to. It's probably a good sign of willingness to integrate. Another thing that I'm thinking is it also can be related to your individual characteristics. For example, once again, if you work for an international company and the language that you use every day is English, and you don't really care a lot about, your local community, your host country, and once again, you are not forced, you're not that interested in learning language. But if you're in the same country and you're not having a job in an international company, if you're interested in be employed by local company, it's in your interest to learn the local language. And the models that we use try to account for all these characteristics, individual-based and country-based. But whether or not it's a better or worse proxy for integration in different countries, it's a very important but a bit separate question from what we're doing, like on average. Like whether if you are in Germany or in Georgia, how would discrimination be relevant for your decision to learn language or to leave this country? And on average, for all those countries, we see that it's relevant and it's negatively affects the decision to stay, and it's negatively affects the decision to learn the local language. Yeah. But it's a very good observation, especially for someone who doesn't do this research, as you said, and just thought about it.
I wonder if we assume that people who learn the language are, let's say, people who are more politically active or more aware of the place where they came, and we decided that maybe they're not politically engaged, but at least they want to stay and maybe learn about the culture and stuff, and they're people who tend to take action because they always left, they decided to stay, they decided to learn the language. Are there any cases that that these people made some, face some discrimination and made some attempt to fight with this, who didn't take an action to move to the next country, but who did take an action to work with against the discrimination? Or it's too early for us to observe it?
So this is something that we didn't check in these particular models. We were trying to understand how being resourceful, how being wealthy affect your decision to leave or stay. I think that decision to learn a language may have something to do with interest to culture and maybe, some reflection on relationship between this country and Russia, for example. I'm not sure, but because our model controls for all characteristic, individual-based characteristics, we can say for now if being more politically engaged, especially in host country affairs, makes you, makes your willingness to learn the language higher. This is something that we don't know, but I think that this is something that can happen. I can imagine it. I don't remember from interviews. I don't remember people describing any attempts to, fight against it. They rather were kind of sympathetic, like, yeah, we understand why it happens. We totally understand, yeah. And I think that they are kind of accepting it.
For how long do you think it's gonna be this way? Like, can you imagine people will be accepting this attitudes toward them forever? Or if it will change after some time, will pass because the shock of like the war and the moving will be like the shock will lie down and we won't tolerate it.
One of the study that we cite here in this paper is a study of the effect of discrimination on political behavior of ethnic minorities, not recent political migrants, but ethnic minorities in, if I'm not mistaken, Great Britain. And what it basically says is that yes, for ethnic minorities who already settled, who've been living in these countries for quite a time, discrimination from local institutes kind of pushes them towards being more politically active and try to, change the situation somehow to engage politically. But discrimination from local citizens has the opposite effect to, isolate them, make them less confident in their abilities to fight anything. So I think that to your question, for ethnic minorities who already settled, maybe not the first generation, but probably second generation of migrants, it may be, we can see that, yes, people will be trying to, to do something about discrimination. But once again, it can be play out differently from discrimination from institutes and from locals. Yeah, thank you.
It looks like we have another question on Zoom from Andrea Liu. Andrea, I'm going to ask you to unmute now.
Hi, sorry, I just have another quick question. I know this was not one of the questions asked in your questionnaire, but I'm curious if the war ended, however we define that. I mean, there's stuff in the news of that Putin wants to negotiate. Let's just imagine a hypothetical situation where somehow there's some resolution, there's some negotiation, and the military operation is over by it's August, just total hypothetical. Do you think most of these people would instantly just go back to Russia? Do you have any sense of that? Or do you think that some of them are now like entrenched in their new habitat? Or I guess it's hard for you to answer because it's not the subject of but I'm just curious what your sense was.
So yeah, the problem with hypothetical situations and these hypothetical questions is that we don't know for sure how a person actually respond to the situation. We know from the other study that conditions in the country of origin is more important for decision to come back than condition in the host country. So I can assume that for many people, if they see that okay, they can come back, it's safe for them, and some conditions, for some reason are not the same. I think that yes, a lot of them would consider coming back. But we unfortunately, because of this situation being hypothetical and because of the questions that we ask them, it's also hypothetical. We don't know for sure what portion of them. But probably for them, conditions in the country of origin, Russia, are just more important compared to what is going on in host countries. That this is something that I think we can speculate about.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of, as I understand it, a lot of changes in civil society in Russia since the war in terms of like, I mean, as everybody knows, being called a foreign agent if you say anything critical. So do you think if that most of your migrants, they were fleeing because of those changes in civil, like that basically dissent, political dissent type thing, that if you think most of the people you're being interviewed were fleeing those very drastic changes in, in Russian civil society and ability to dissent after February 2022 with the foreigners rule and all that stuff about.
So many of them are trying to build a new lives in the countries that they are currently in. They're trying to integrate themselves and trying to integrate their children if they have any. And yeah, I think it's also largely depends on how long they will be staying in the host societies and what would it cost for them to come back and to start, living your lives again from square one, once again in Russia. So yeah, it depends on many factors.
Thank you.
Is there any major outliers in your model that you took a look at?
We don't have major outliers because we have very limited,
I mean, by country, for example.
You mean for levels of discrimination?
For the overall connection between the discrimination and the willingness to learn language.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that we have major outliers.
Any more questions? Okay. If not, I think we can wrap up. Cool. Thank you so much for a very good presentation.